Thank you all for coming. Very excited to have you all here and to talk about plants and consciousness. Thinking with plants can expand conversations around consciousness. And I will be speaking about the emerging vegetal turn in the humanities and also plants themselves as intelligence, agential, and relational beings. I'll be talking a little bit about psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapies and talk a bit about the vegetal turn and psychedelics and also relate that to consciousness, and then I hope we can have a conversation together and open it up for some conversation. All right, so I'll just start with some disclosures and acknowledgements. As Deepak mentioned, I am with the California Institute of Integral Studies, and it's a university in San Francisco, California. I don't have any other disclosures to share. And I wanted to offer some personal acknowledgements. I would like to thank my teachers and colleagues in the field, as well as noting that I primarily focus on the Western tradition, since that's my own personal and intellectual lineage. And my background's in philosophy and religion, and I come from a place about an hour north of San Francisco called Sonoma County that is Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo territory is represented by the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria. So that's where I'm coming from here to you today in Zurich. And I'd like to just begin with the plants themselves. So this is a picture, it's confocal microscopy of the plant Banisteriopsis caapi. So this is from an artistic project called Microcosms on sacred plants of the Americas. And I want to thank Stephen White and Jill Flughaber for letting me share these photos with you today. So this is Banisteriopsis caapi, it's a vine. And then I also wanted to share with you this, which is Psychotria viridis. So this plant here is a flowering shrub. So these are two of the plants that are often used in the Amazon to form the brew ayahuasca. And I just want to acknowledge that there are many names for these plants in the Amazonian region. They're very important to the indigenous peoples there. And I think these two images, since they're so enhanced, they're very vibrant, and they kind of show something of the vibrancy of the plants themselves. And I wanted to bring them in here, and especially with the Banisteriopsis, the caapi, there, I think that I like the twists in the image. They're very similar to the vines, the twists of the vines. These plants are in deep relationship with the people and places where they grow, as well as with each other. And I want to acknowledge these long lineages of indigenous traditions and knowledge and philosophy around these two plants in particular. So these plants both appear throughout my slides and presentation as part of my phytocentric or dendrocentric intention. And I wanted to bring the plants into the room in this way. We'll be looking at some other plants later as well. So just as a brief overview, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about plant studies in the vegetal turn. We'll talk a bit about psychedelics, talk about consciousness and psychedelic plants, as well as fungi. And then sacred plants, and then talk about some vegetal and fungal pathways moving forward. And I want to open up some questions around plants and consciousness. So plant studies and the vegetal turn. Plant studies is an emerging field in the humanities, and it's been growing quickly over the past decade or so with several publications, conferences, coursework. There's now a new journal called Plant Perspectives that just started this year. And it's an interdisciplinary field that impacts history, anthropology, philosophy, literature, even geography, has had some really interesting plant studies publications. And it's founded and in conversation with biology, ecology, forestry, and other research in the sciences. Just wanted to note that this field has been variously called plant studies, which is what I usually hear now, as well as critical plant studies, plant humanities, or less commonly human plant studies. And what really distinguishes this field is this focus on the plants themselves, thinking about the plants as beings, as we'll talk a little bit more about some of these capacities, but as figures and characters in the study itself, rather than external or objects to be studied. So here's some ongoing conversations in the field, just to give you a sense. There's recovering vegetal and arboreal knowledges. So this is both from the Western tradition as well as non-appropriatively from other cultures across the globe, and often using a decolonial framework. Scholars are also reinterpreting and highlighting literature and art with trees and plants, and looking at this in literature, the environmental humanities, how trees and plants show up in various novels or pieces of art that could be looked at more deeply. And then refocusing fields and studies towards vegetal beings. So I mentioned some of these fields already. And as well as personhood. So some scholars are proponents of personhood for plants. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later as well. I hope that can be maybe part of our conversation. A large ongoing debate is around plant ethics and plants' rights. So extending moral concern for plants. And then another piece is the role of personal narrative and how personal narrative comes into scholarly work with plants, and especially experiences around plants. And I think this is one area of intersection between plant studies and psychedelics, especially psychedelic research and emerging psychedelic humanities that we'll talk about. Where does personal narrative really fit in? I think this is an ongoing topic of discussion.
And one question on vegetal and arboreal, how do you vegetal is more vegetation, arboreal is more trees?
Right, so vegetal would include all plants, whereas arboreal is more focused on trees, which is not as clear-cut as it seems. Some plants that seem like they may be trees are not considered trees, and other trees are quite small or seem like they may not be trees. So that distinction is not quite as clear-cut as it may be. But I use both terms depending on the topic. Thank you. I want to talk about Western plant intelligence research and some of the scientific studies that are happening that have been key over the past several decades, actually, that underlie the plant studies in the humanities and the vegetal turn that I'll talk about soon. Apologies, that jumped ahead quite a bit. There we go. So there's different terminology that's used in the sciences. One is plant intelligence, and the person who has proposed this is physiologist and biologist Tony Trewavas, who prefers plant intelligence to talk about these plant capacities. This term does have some critique that we'll talk about. Plant neurobiology was also proposed by cognitive scientist and philosopher Paco Calvo and others. This term has often been critiqued and is not widely used anymore in the field because plants don't have neurons. So many people have critiqued the idea of plant neurobiology, so very few people are using this term now. Plant cognition is another term that some scholars use. Biologist and interdisciplinary scholar Monica Galliano is one who uses this term, plant cognition, a lot, and that implies a focus on the mind. And it's also received critique around ideas of vegetal cognition, since it's cognitive processes in vegetation is a little bit of a leap from the research. It also could be considered anthropomorphic. Plant awareness is another term that's used, and I find this terminology a bit more compelling. Plants are certainly aware enough of their environment to react. And then plant consciousness is one that's considered, and also has similar critiques to cognition. We'll talk quite a bit more about that soon. And then plant signaling and behavior is a term that is much closer to the terminology that's used in scientific animal research, and is much more, it's in the conversation now. So plant signaling and behavior is the term that's accepted and often used. There's a journal of plant signaling and behavior, and many people have started to use that terminology. So some of you may be aware of this study. This is Suzanne Simard's study in the 90s on the Wood Wide Web. It was in the journal Nature, and it talks about the mycorrhizal networks. Her research is cutting edge in terms of the way that fungi and trees talk and communicate with each other. And this article was her breakout article, caused a lot of buzz with trees talking to each other. This is another article by Omer Falik and team on non-self discrimination. And in this article, the biologists studied pea plants and were able to find that pea plants would actually, with their roots, if they came across a similar root to their own other root, they would not compete as much. The roots would go shorter and not as quickly. Whereas if they came across a root that was not their own, a root from another plant, they would grow more quickly, be more competitive. So they call this non-self discrimination. The plant can tell whether the root is their own or not. This next article is by entomologist and ecologist Richard Carbon, and he worked with sagebrush plants and looked at the sagebrush plants that could distinguish between their own similar plants that are more closely related versus plants that are not as closely related, and use this information to cooperate with attacks using volatile organic chemicals. So the term that is used there is kin recognition. The plants can recognize kin plants more closely. And his research has now progressed, and he's now talked also in sagebrush about personality and thinking about stable behaviors is the term that he's using over time, that one plant has these behaviors that are seen as stable over time and actually considered as personality. Ooh, apologies that this is jumping around a little bit. Okay, there we go. This next article is around memory and learning in plants. And this is Monica Galliano's work that I mentioned a bit earlier. Monica Galliano worked with this plant called Mimosa pudica, which is the shy plant. And the reason that it's called that is because the leaves will fold on a human time scale. If touched, you can actually see that the leaves will fold kind of like a book and come together on a very quick time scale. So what Galliano and her team did, they dropped the plant several times until the plant stopped reacting, knowing that the drop was not a danger. And then, so they called that learning, that the plant learned that the drop was not a danger. And then several days later, they tested it multiple days in the future after the plant had experienced that drop, and it continued to do that, where it did not close its leaves in response to the drop. They called that memory. They also shook the plant, and so the plant did close its leaves with the shaking motion, so it wasn't some sort of non-reactive moment for that particular plant. So that was an example of learning and memory in plants.
Why would a plant have a behaviour like that at all? What's the reason?
The learning behavior?
The folding of the leaves.
It's a protective measure. So they fold their leaves if there's any kind of disturbance or they sense any kind of danger, they'll fold their leaves very quickly. And my understanding is it's to make the plant seem smaller and less appetizing to any kind of predators.
Okay, so it doesn't protect the leaf. If there's a herbivore, it can eat a folded leaf just as well.
But it does make it much smaller.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and less obvious. This is actually one of my favorite articles on anesthetics. This was a team led by bioscientist Ken Yokawa, and they tested several plants, some of which we've already talked about, like the Mimosa pudica plant and the pea plant and others, with anesthetics. So they actually put some liquid anesthetics in the roots, and then they covered the other plants and put a gaseous anesthetic in the cover, and found that the plants stopped their movements. So the Mimosa pudica would not fold. Pea plants have this rotational movement that stopped, and then that movement came back slowly over time. So they felt that the plants were reacting to the anesthetics, and they actually mentioned that this could potentially have some way for us to learn more about the underlying mechanisms of consciousness, which is one of the few scientific articles that's really mentioned consciousness and plants in this way. And I want to just acknowledge that these studies are on specific plants, so I'm not trying to extrapolate to all plants here, but I do want to say that these studies may point towards something that's relevant to vegetal being overall. That these capacities that these plants are showing may point towards something that we as humans are missing in the plants. Unfortunately, I don't have time to delve here into what is a plant, but maybe we could talk about it when we get there. It goes into your question, Deepak, about vegetal and arboreal. So following these studies and building on them and in conversation with them, in the humanities there's what's being called the vegetal turn. It's a scholarly turn in the humanities towards considering plants themselves and their capacities, and it's in the lineage of other recent intellectual turns. So turns like the ontological turn, or the animal turn, or the post-human turn that continue to expand the sphere of concern in the humanities. And here's a quote that I won't read the whole quote here, but these two authors are talking about where the animal turn extends to animals, what was once exclusively the province of the human, sentience, intelligence, ethics, etc. The vegetal turn extends these claims. Plants too should be given agency, understood as organisms with sentience, intelligence, feelings, and sociality. So this is what they're arguing in terms of the plant capacities. I don't use all of these terms myself, but I do work with some other terms. Vegetal and arboreal philosophy. So my primary field of study is philosophy, and this field is part of the vegetal turn and looks at questions around the ontological assumptions about plants and trees in the Western perspective. So, for example, going back to some of the founders of Western philosophy with Plato and Aristotle, and looking at the ways that they spoke about plants in terms of the vegetative soul and the hierarchy of being, and looking again at those ideas. Considers expanded ethical implications. So if plants are beings, then what does that mean for ethics and human-plant relationships? How might things change? Discusses epistemological concerns. How do we know, as humans, what plants are, what their capacities are, some of the other epistemological concerns around it. And then attends to phenomenological approaches to experience, and looking at I think we can only look at our own experience in this way. And one of the main philosophers who talks about plants, Michael Marder, who's one of the foremost scholars at this point, talks about a phytophenomenology, so vegetal phenomenology, looking at the plants themselves. So I wanted to talk a bit about a philosophy of vegetal capacities. I've also talked about this as an arboreal ontology when I've looked more so at trees. But it proposes that plants and trees are intelligent, agential, and relational. So I want to go into these in a bit more detail. So here's a bit more about vegetal intelligence. Intelligence is the capacity to assess the environment and choose from among alternative possibilities and alternatives. So it's problem solving. And this is an expanded definition of intelligence. It involves learning, communication, and memory. So learning requires both having a goal as well as a way to assess errors in the journey towards that goal. So for example, with Monica Galiano's research, where she dropped the Mimosa pudica plant many times, and the plant learned that the drop was not a danger, and so left its leaves open. And then communication is the transfer of information within or between plants. So for example, with the mycorrhizal networks that Suzanne Simard has studied, that this transfer between the plants and fungi is a communication of water, of nutrients, and of information. And then memory is the ability to retrieve and reuse that relevant information from past experiences to respond to current situations. So again, with Monica Galliano's work, that the plant was able to remember that the drop was not a danger multiple days after the drops happened. And vegetal agency is intentional action. So vegetal agency is intentional action on the part of the plant. It depends on intelligence, as well as this capacity to act decisively, rather than to merely respond to the environment. And plants could be making decisions that are imperceptible to humans all the time. We may just not be aware of the decisions that plants are making, because they operate on such different timescales than we do, and they operate in places underground, invisible to human eyes, for example. There's a big critique around this, that it could just be automated responsiveness and not agential action. I think this one is the one with the most critique around it, that plants could have agency. And then vegetal relationality. Relationality is connections to other beings, whether symbiotic or not. This is seen in the ecological networks throughout the forest and the mycorrhizal networks that we just talked about, as well as between plants and humans. And it's based on kinship, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few slides, but the kin recognition, for example, are those relationships between the plants themselves. Next, I want to shift topics just a bit and talk about psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapy, which has been coming into practice more and more over the past several decades. And this is very much grounded in the clinical psychology field and psychiatry medical field as well. So the word psychedelic means mind manifesting. It was coined by Humphrey Osmond in a letter to Aldous Huxley in 1957. And it's important to know that this is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So it's not that the psychedelic is doing the work, but the medicine of the psychedelic is assisting the therapeutic processes towards healing. Research here is very important. In the United States, the only way to access these medicines in most states is through research and clinical trials. There's a few states that have opened up in Oregon, and Colorado is opening up next year. I've just learned a lot more about what's happening in Switzerland with compassionate care, and that more and more people are getting access to psychedelic therapies through compassionate care here in Switzerland. As I mentioned, the therapies, it's a therapeutic model around the psychedelics themselves, that they're therapists and typically two people in the room during a session that are licensed clinicians and professionals who can provide the therapy, along with preparation and integration afterwards. The classic psychedelics are substances like LSD, psilocybin, peyote, ayahuasca. And then there are also entactogens or empathogens, meaning a kind of touching within, and that's MDMA, MDA, etc. I don't have time tonight to go into some of the research around these substances, but in particular psilocybin is being studied for depression and anxiety, and MDMA has been studied for PTSD. And then there's also ketamine, which in the United States is used off-label. Ketamine's an anesthetic and dissociative, so it's a bit different than the classic psychedelics or empathogens, but it is legal off-label, at least in the United States, and I understand it is here as well. I want to highlight this is part of a long lineage in terms of a historical tradition of healing, and is very much embedded in many indigenous cultures and practices. There's ancient use of psychoactive plants from 11,000 BC. For example, there's the Kaikion in the Eleusinian Mysteries in Greece. There's Soma in the Vedic texts in India. Hallucinogenic mushrooms exist in many cultures. They grow around the world. There's over something like more than 200 species of mushrooms that contain psilocybin. And then there's ayahuasca in the Amazonian region, which we talked about with those two images. And then there's iboga in Africa, particularly in Gabon, which we'll talk a bit about more later on as well. I want to just mention a little bit about the Western clinical perspective. The early research into the psychedelics happened in the 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s. And there was quite a bit of an excitement around it and lots of research, and then there was prohibition and the war on drugs. So the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 made many of these substances illegal, and MDMA came a few years later. Now, at least in the US, many psychedelics are on the DEA Schedule I substances, and I understand they're also here in Europe similarly prohibited. And I want to just mention that prohibition and the war on drugs has disproportionately impacted BIPOC communities. However, there's been a recent resurgence in the Western scientific research, again over the past few decades. So in some ways, the plant studies work and the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy work have been in parallel in some ways. I'm just going to mention some organizations training in psychedelic-assisted therapy and research, and I'll do this kind of quickly, but these are all US-based. UC Berkeley has been doing it since 2022. California Institute of Integral Studies, where I work, we've been doing it since 2016. Fluence in New York has many different programs. The Integrative Psychiatry Institute in Colorado, as well as Oregon. Naropa University is another university in Colorado. And then the University of Wisconsin-Madison has a master's degree in pharmaceutical sciences. And then ketamine, there's many ketamine trainings in the United States. And I understand there are some trainings that are starting to come into play here in Europe as well. One place that I did want to highlight is psychedelic humanities. This is just a field that's just beginning. We're starting to talk about psychedelic humanities or psychedelic studies, but I prefer psychedelic humanities, in fields like sociology, history, anthropology, philosophy, critical studies as well, and literature and art, thinking about what psychedelics may hold for the humanities or what the humanities can bring to psychedelic therapies. And this is a quote from one of the guides who, the facilitators who works at Johns Hopkins University, Mary Casamano. She's worked there for many years and just recently has left actually, but she has done something like more than 500 psilocybin sessions working with people with depression and eating disorders, and she talks about that one of the main outcomes of the experimental psilocybin sessions at Johns Hopkins is to enable individuals to know themselves so they can reconnect with their authentic selves, to the selves they once were, or in some cases are only now discovering for the first time who they really are. Once they have reconnected to themselves, they can then connect to others. I view the connection to ourselves, to others, and to everything as love, our true nature. So I appreciate that Mary Casamano brings this idea of love with psychedelic-assisted therapies to the forefront. This quote doesn't quite say it, but she talks about it quite a bit, about how love and joy is so essential in life and in the psychedelic-assisted therapy field as well. So I want to also talk about consciousness with psychedelic plants and fungi. And I'm going to be careful here because I'm very much on the side of working with these plants and these medicines in places where it's legal and where it's possible to do so legally. And so I do that with that in mind. I speak about this with that in mind. I want to make just a note about memory. So memory is really important here, and remembering the plants, keeping the plants themselves at the forefront is something that I'd like to do here. And I want to draw here on the work of phenomenologist Edward Casey. So I've already talked a little bit about plant memory, at least kind of a basic recall for plants. But and I want to say that it's a significant point here to also remember the original peoples who are in relationship with these plants and continuing the tradition with these plants. But Edward S. Casey talks extensively about a phenomenology of remembering and memory. And remembering can be an intentional act, a calling to mind or cognition, something that we've previously experienced. Casey reminds us that remembering is a ubiquitous part of human life. I also want to talk about recollection, which is similar to remembering but has this added implication of gathering together knowledge, maybe knowledge that we once had. And then Casey also talks about recognizing, which is, it requires identifying. It requires a identification of the objects of memory. And that, I want to also talk about recognizing also as recognizing, something that we maybe already know. And then naming is also a significant part of the practice of memory. So I want to acknowledge these plants have been known by many names in many different cultures. And I use the westernized names here because that's my own tradition and my own situational perspective. And the indigenous and local names offer value and specificity as much as these westernized names. There are many, many trees and plants that I could have chosen, so I've only highlighted a few here. And I don't propose to be an expert on these plants at all, but my purpose is really to bring the psychedelic plants themselves to the forefront and into the room. So even if you may know a bit about these plants or a lot about these plants, I want to suggest to look at the pictures and just remember what you know of the plant itself. So the first plant is the sassafras, nutmeg, or camphor tree. And I've here showed both the westernized names here. And this is a picture of a sassafras albidum in the southeast U.S. So it's quite a large tree and has it's quite a large tree, and they're quite tall with their bark can have these stunning red and brown colors in it, and they have large leaves that turn colors in the fall. And then they have these yellow-green flowers and small dark fruits. And so how this tree is connected to psychedelics is that part of one of the oils that can be derived from this tree is saffrol. And saffrol is a precursor to MDMA. It can be. So each of these trees saffrol could be harvested for MDMA to be synthesized. And the production of illegal MDMA is actually linked to deforestation, particularly in Brazil and Southeast Asia, where there's quite a bit of deforestation going on. And currently, the MDMA that's used for many of the studies is not made from trees. It's made from a synthesized product from crude oil, actually. But I want to highlight this arboreal connection with MDMA. That originally this substance was deeply interconnected with this particular species of tree. The next tree here is an acacia tree, and acacia trees contain DMT, primarily in the roots. And this particular species that I've listed here is a mountain buffalo wattle, or a buffalo sallow wattle. This tree is actually critically endangered and exists only in Australia on a particular mountain, on Mount Buffalo in Victoria, Australia. And it's endangered both because of human poaching for the DMT, so its locations are highly protected, but also by a wasp that destroys the tree. These trees are used by many First Nations people in Australia, and there are at least 50 acacia trees that contain DMT, many, many more that are outside of Australia. And I mentioned that their locations are protected, and this is a beautiful tree. It's kind of a smaller tree, a little smaller, a little bit shrubbier, and it has yellow flowers on it. So this is a picture of the leaf of this tree. I mentioned iboga earlier, and this is the iboga shrub. It's a West African shrub, and the medicine ibogaine is derived from this plant. It's getting a lot of press right now in the US for addiction treatment. And iboga is a small forest shrub with a striking orange fruit. It's a very sacred and ceremonial plant for those of the Bwiti tradition, especially in Gabon, but also other areas in Africa. So I think this plant is really beautiful with those bright orange fruits. And then wanted to bring forward the peyote cactus. So this is a peyote, and it's vulnerable to being endangered. This cactus contains mescaline and grows in Mexico, Texas, in the United States. It's a small cactus on the ground, has these flowers and little fruits, and it's often not included in decriminalization requests in the United States due to requests from indigenous leaders, because they would like to have these plants for their own communities. And some leaders from indigenous communities have even asked that non-indigenous people not use this plant as a medicine so that their communities can have them. So I wanted to make just a brief note about the fungal turn. So this is to include mushrooms, perhaps in the vegetal turn or with its own fungal or mycelial turn, also acknowledging the mycorrhizal networks and the connections between plants and fungi. Very few people have talked about a fungal or mycelial turn, but I think it's important to think about them as well, especially in terms of psychedelics. And psilocybe mushrooms, as I mentioned, there's about more than 200 species of mushrooms that contain psilocybin. So there's lots of those. And then this is the fungus that actually where ergot comes from, that where LSD was originally derived. So it's a fungus that grows on wheat, that in Europe primarily, as I understand, and it has ergot in it, and LSD can be derived from it. So I wanted to ask this question: how might psychedelic medicine change if the plants are acknowledged? So what might happen if the plants themselves were brought forward? And I think it's an open question. I think Western society often thinks about plants as resources, and these ideas are quite radical. So thinking about agriculture, forest production could mean major changes if these ideas are considered. And psychedelic medicine is following Western science, and I think rightly so, for the data, for the efficacy, for safety. But these ideas from plant studies might show a way from within the Western tradition to respect the plants, and especially those people who have traditionally been in relationship with them. I wanted to also share today about sacred plants. Talk a little bit about the sacred. So this is a quote from Keith Williams and colleagues in this excellent article called Indigenous Philosophies in the Psychedelic Renaissance. And they speak about how, since pre-colonial times, indigenous peoples from Turtle Island to Abayala have considered sacred and visionary plants, and many other plants as well, as living beings. It's possible to communicate through ritual, ceremonial languages. It's about that according to indigenous ontologies, these sacred plants are not isolated from the territory. Just to say a word about contemporary indigenous philosophies, and this is again from this article and somewhat based on Haudenosaunee traditions in the United States, in North America. Plants are more than human beings. They're based on relational ontologies, so relational ontology of being. There's a focus on the land, as in that quote, there's a focus on the plants with the territory, so not just the plants alone. And then this idea of sacred plant medicines. And this is another image from that art project, the Microcosms Project, another image of Minister Mrs. Cappy as well. Western animistic perspectives could sometimes be resonant with these philosophies. Animism is a belief or conviction that non-human beings have a soul or spirit or personhood or consciousness. And this is a Western idea. So this is an idea from the 19th century, coming from the Western tradition, often applied to other cultures, but it's really a Western concept. It's predicated on relationships as well. And one concept that some scholars have proposed, particularly philosopher Matthew Hall, is plant personhood. So this is extending a type of vegetal personhood to plants. And some of the terminology that's used is more than human or other than human persons. So this personhood is not the same as human personhood, but could be similar in various ways, but is also particular to the vegetal beings. And I also want to propose potentially a psychedelic plant personhood. Open up some questions about what might that look like. I wanted to also just note that there are many contemporary sacred plants, maybe some that are in your own lives. Tea or coffee. There's often a ritual around these sacred plants in our culture. Heating the water, steeping the plant, sitting with the cup, those kinds of things. Wheat, grapes with wine, for example, rice as well, could be considered contemporary sacred plants. And I wanted to think about some vegetal and fungal pathways for going forward. So these are some potential future pathways. There are more calls in the psychedelic field for humanities scholars and ethicists. So I think this is one potential place of integration between plant studies and psychedelics. Developing ethical frameworks, particularly decolonial ethical frameworks. One particular way that this could happen is a place-based vegetal or arboreal idea of rights. I've done a little bit of work on this, that we do have to, as humans, use plants for our food, for buildings, for heat. But is there a way that the place itself, the plant could have a right to the place itself? And then I wanted to open up some questions for discussion. How is human consciousness affected by plants? Maybe there are many ways that we could talk about that human consciousness can be affected by plants. And then, can plants themselves be considered conscious? Or is there another or a better word for these plant capacities and the ways that plants are? Many people have experiences with plants, so I'd love to talk about that as well. And this is a quote by Catriona Sandilands, who's a plant studies scholar as well, and says, "In all honesty, the vegetal has been turning for a long time, and the plants have never actually been forgotten." So I'd like to propose that this is actually a vegetal return, that this vegetal return is honoring cross-cultural lineages of plant wisdom, and that it's an opportunity for psychedelic humanities, for the humanities themselves, or for anyone to engage with the plants themselves. That could be embracing the psychedelic or fungal turn in psychedelic research, that there could be more synergies between these fields. And skip that one for now. And I'll say thank you. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.